For Trichomes.com, I'm Jesse Betend, and this is The High Ground. On this show, we feature leaders of the cannabis industry. We talk to everyone from farmers to CEOs and public officials, anyone making an impact on the cannabis community and beyond. We are officially less than a week away from the presidential election, and the truth is that anybody who tells you that they know exactly what's going to happen and how that's going to affect any particular industry is probably stretching the truth. Predictions can sometimes be unhelpful, but preparing for the future, of course, is a necessity. And according to my guest today, no matter what happens next week, both outcomes for cannabis investors aren't bad. Matt Nordgren is the CEO of Arcadian Capital. He's also the managing partner of the Arcadian Fund, which has a portfolio of ancillary cannabis companies. I decided to call Matt up and ask him how you prepare for a moment like this where futures diverge. And more importantly, what the election will mean for cannabis. Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, glad to be here. Thank you for having us.
So we are in a pretty dramatic moment, I would say, for not just the country and the world, but also the industry. When it comes to the election, which is less than a month away, how do you think and how do you plan for a moment like this where outcomes could be very different?
Well, it's a great question. And the timing of certain things happening in business is ultimately the one thing I think a lot of people don't realize is probably the most common denominator when you look back in history, ultimately to be able to determine the success of an investment. It's timing. A lot of other important things, but timing, which also can be the most difficult thing to predict and plan around. So a long way of saying we don't know what's going to happen, but I'm happy to share some thoughts. Because one thing we've learned in highly regulated industry is it's not just what party is sitting in the presidential seat or who has control of the Senate or Congress, but every seat can be important, can be very important. And so it's almost impossible to know that level of detail. And when you're trying to convince the institutional class to enter this industry, which frankly they haven't in great masses yet, only a few, you really have to de-risk things quite a bit and to underwrite what is going to happen at least the next 2 years and pretty much the next 4, we think is going to be critical in terms of the last or some of the last components to bringing in some of these institutional investors that have been on the sideline. So I'm glad you started with that question because it's certainly the most important topic on all of our minds in this industry. And it could be very different one way or the other. Let's get into that because I know you have some questions on it and we'll try to make sense of it. But the reality is neither scenario is a bad one, but they are different. And it's really important to understand why they're different.
Let's just start there. How does who wins the presidency impact the future of the cannabis industry in your estimation?
Well, let's say that it stays Republican, and let's say Donald Trump wins, and let's just assume that if it's going to stay the same, the Senate stays Republican, and Mitch McConnell is heading the Republican-led Senate, and probably Congress stays Democratic, it appears, but who knows? But let's just assume that happens. That's a scenario where you could expect hemp and hemp-related products to have a better opportunity to get laws passed over the next 2 to 4 years. Along with that, we anticipate medical cannabis to have an opportunity to pass some significant laws as well. If it went Democratic, let's say Biden wins, and let's just say it's a clean sweep and the Senate is also Democratic, you would anticipate, based on a whole bunch of recent happenings, including Kamala Harris's statements on the vice presidential debate, I mean, there's reason to believe that a lot of the cannabis-related activity gets its attention. Things like those in jail for cannabis related offenses. Ridiculous. That will get its day right away. And descheduling will as well, as Biden has said. Not sure what they're going to deschedule to, but certainly some form of descheduling. And these are things that you have to really feel confident that the cannabis business will have potentially a little bit more aggressive of a timeline if the Democrats were to have a clean sweep. That doesn't necessarily mean that medical and hemp-related byproducts won't be addressed as well. But over the last 4 years, having watched a Congress and a Senate that are opposing, we've just seen that the two sides, which cannabis and hemp really, in our opinion, is a bipartisan issue, potentially the last of our lifetime maybe, but because they've had a lot of years to be opposed, they've just naturally gone down different paths in terms of what both sides would like to push forward. And I think that would continue depending on which party's in control. And so that's our assumption. Of course, every seat matters. As you look at a person like William Barr, who, frankly, as we know now, basically as one individual held up a number of things happening that would have been very beneficial to a lot of earlier investors in some private companies that were looking at some M&A deals. But he decided not to let those happen, and that was disastrous for many companies. But if that position had been someone else and he let those deals happen, many companies would be in a different place. And so it just shows you it's not just about who's the president. It's not just about what party's in control of what, Congress or Senate, but it's also who's in what particular seat on state initiatives and various other things. So we really do have to look all the way through. I think a lot of major allocators are looking at this space this year and are more excited to allocate resources to it than they ever have before. But they also look at it and they know that institutional inflection has not happened yet. And so there's no real reason to rush in. I think most of the conversations we have with those folks, they understand that there are ways that we can predict some outcomes based on what may or may not happen. But the reality is they're all waiting until that happens, because why wouldn't you? They haven't made the move yet. Yes, they're more excited about it, but there's no real intriguing factor as to why they need to deploy institutional resources today, knowing that the election will help provide a lot of information as to what direction they want to run and how fast. Again, I don't think any of them are bad, but it may change how quickly you might want to move with one category that is underneath the cannabinoid industry or cannabis and hemp industry as opposed to another.
One of the first internships that I had was with a newspaper, and it was actually during the 2016 election. And that was the first time that, I guess this is an obvious statement, but I never realized it before. They make two versions of the newspaper, one for they don't know who's going to win ahead of time, obviously. So they have to have President option A and President option B. And I went in the next day after the election and I saw, presidential option did not win in the trash discard pile on the computer. Do you have a similar approach to looking at future, paths that you might walk?
Well, what we try to do this year, I mean, of course, COVID hit earlier in the year in the first quarter. Mm-hmm. And you had to really, as a manager of a lot of companies in the industry, you really had to focus on those companies and make sure everybody was doing good. And for us, they are doing great, and we're really happy about that. But it took a period of time. Everybody who runs a fund had to get in and make sure that their companies had the best chance to be positioned to survive and thrive, no matter what the industry, frankly. But in ours, so that took many of us, 2-3 months to feel some level of comfort. And so it was only till about maybe June that you started to really feel comfortable about where your companies were, where the industry was, watching the industry consistently perform, because the first month was crazy good numbers. And the second month, was this going to continue? And then the third month after Corona started, now you're feeling pretty good. We're essential across the board. And so, it just took 3 or 4 months before you even thought about it. And then you look up and now you're only 120, 150 days out from the election at that time.
Yeah, no kidding.
And so you're saying to yourself, why would I make a big move at this moment in time, even though the industry is more attractive than it ever has been before and performing well? It didn't seem like with 120 or 150 days out that it wasn't worth for some categories waiting. Now, your question was, how do you think about that? Well, if you're in a certain category that maybe has, could have a greater impact as a result of the election one way or another, then we would probably look to hold off until after November for that type of a deal. That may include, maybe a new state that's got new licenses being issued and someone's looking to enter that market. That's probably a good long-term opportunity, but right now, too risky. Touching the plant in a new state, new licenses, it would be hard for me not to wait and see. If you were, an industry-leading software SaaS-based business that maybe is focused on CRM or inventory management, that is a different type of category because it really doesn't matter as much what happens in November. As long as you think the thing is going to move forward, and over the years it has at a 33 to 36% compound annual growth number on average. And this year, many people are saying 40. But even if it's the same as it has been in the past, that's all you need for that type of a business to feel like it has a future, because it didn't matter what state moved, or is it medical? Is it CBD? Is it cannabis recreational? Is it this country? Is it that country? It matters less. It just matters that the whole thing moves forward, because a software company does not own a license and can operate in any state or any country that it thinks has a good opportunity to do business. And so we've actually been more aggressive there because the industry has done so well. We've been more aggressive in deploying capital over the last 4 or 5 months in those types of businesses, because we are more confident than we have been ever before that the industry is here to stay. But there are certain categories that could be more affected by the election, and those we've elected to be passive for now.
Obviously, the other thing that you not only mentioned, but that the industry has been living through is the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic. What we've seen is that there's been a lot of opportunities, expanded opportunities for delivery, curbside opportunities. How important are those software, payment, online store services to this industry? And is that something to look towards as perhaps, a more consistent thing than political tides? It seems like COVID-19 is going to be impacting us for a while, and likely these new opportunities are not going to necessarily go away. Would that be a fair assessment?
It's a fair assessment. And if you think about this industry, which properly should be categorized as emerging for many reasons, but specifically lack of institutional resources, and they're coming, but they aren't here yet. You have to be open to pivot. 2 years ago, valuations started to correct as they needed to on some of these public companies. And then maybe you had a vape crisis, and then you have this and that. And in an emerging industry, it's really more, you have to plan on A to Z and, pay attention to every step along the way, but they can't matter so much that they kill you. You kind of have to plan for that margin of error in advance in an industry that is like this when things change a lot. And so many companies have done that. Many companies haven't. And the ones that prepared for the future and prepared for things to happen are doing great. COVID obviously is about as bad as anything could possibly be. And you don't know that's going to happen, but you're prepared for things to happen. And so these entrepreneurs, I can just tell you, are battle tested. and they are phenomenal. It just feels like they're in business fighting for human rights. That's what this industry feels like. It feels like everyone's so compelled. And so, to answer your question, there has not been consumer habits developed. I mean, yes, people smoke flower and they have for tens of thousands of years. And for a long time, people have understood there's some type of edibles, brownies, or some other things. But the majority of the world does not have an idea or a clue that there are hundreds and hundreds of products coming from these plants that will be a part of everyday life for your pet or for medical or for recreational, for, go to Home Depot, textiles, fabrics, concretes. And so there's just so many categories that it almost feels probably how some of the early technology folks felt, like a Steve Jobs in his garage, where it's sort of that perfect culmination of technology being at the right place, having the vision to put something in a consumer product for the consumer that they didn't even know existed. And that's what this industry is. Every day, we're constantly surprised about how these entrepreneurs are so motivated to bring these products to the world, that COVID has frankly not been as bad of a situation as others the industry has already faced. So, as terrible as it is, because the industry has been essential, because these products are not available to the general consumer in the world, in terms of, if you compared it to alcohol, for example, alcohol probably did pretty good on a curbside pickup or delivery. I would assume those numbers are up for alcohol, but I can tell you what's down for sure is their sell through commercial establishments, right? So, and probably significantly. So if you look at all the alcohol sales in the world and you, before COVID, said what percentage of those is picked up on the curb or delivered, my guess is a pretty small percentage as compared to all the alcohol sold at sporting events and travel companies and this and that. Cannabis didn't have that. You couldn't be sold anywhere else. You could only be picked up or sold through two areas, a retail or a depot. That was it, distributor, deliverer. And so those, frankly, all stayed alive. They've done very well, as other delivery and pickup have, businesses have done in other categories. The main difference is we didn't have commercial exposure to lose. This is a private supplement for most people. They consume it and use it privately. And they will learn that it's going to be a commercial product and to be utilized in many commercial environments. But by having commercial places not available, public places not available, that's not an area with which cannabis generated profit anyways. And so it has been a really good, thing for the industry to look at and say, here we are. We've not only survived, but we've thrived in an environment where half of the other world's assets are much less attractive than they were before. So relatively speaking, it definitely puts it on the map if it wasn't before. But the consumer, frankly, has not had a lot of say in the industry today. And that's changing, and the rules are changing. And post-November, we expect certain regulatory things to change. But it's going back to the Steve Jobs analogy. I mean, you didn't know the Apple iPhone was coming. No one could have had a clue. They didn't know. But when you have the technology, and I think this industry does, it's just different. It's internal, human-based technology, homeostasis technology. And now we can package that up and put it in consumer products. It's not just replacing something on the shelf. You don't have to compete with something else. This is an opportunity to basically create an entirely new shelf that didn't even exist before. So in that sense, there's a lot of reasons to be looking forward to the consumer business. But as we sit here today, don't think anybody has necessarily won anything in that category, and that provides a lot of opportunity.
So let's talk about how that informs your approach. Currently, Arcadia Fund is invested in ancillary cannabis companies. How does legalization kind of play into the way that you might interact with this industry or the opportunities that would suddenly become available?
Well, it certainly changes things. We tried to reverse engineer our strategy rather than building something and they will come. And you've seen both. It's not bad to do it either way, but we really think about de-risking a strategy, and that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be legalized, but we need to make sure that enough larger resources have the appetite. And if they do, we will build a strategy for them. We don't try to put it ahead of it. Said another way, it's an emerging industry, and I think you should be focused on venture type positions. If you do credit or debt or public deals, you got to be careful because this is not the environment that's set up for that. There's a reason why in the US we started all these venture exemptions in the, I think, 70s, because it was recognized that there was not a lot of advantage to building strategy to invest in these kind of early to mid stage companies. And ever since then, now you have basically seen our economy completely flip on its head. I mean, everything in the 60s and before, business wise, is kind of not there anymore. If you think about it, even some of the big ones. And now the biggest companies in the world are all born out of the venture environment, if you think about it. And that is an interesting thing to think about, because that's where typically you can take on capital at a point and have the structure and exemption such that if 20% of your companies are 80% of your return, that's supposed to be okay. That's really supposed to be okay. But if you try to go do a strategy in an emerging industry that's so dependent on certain things happening, you can get yourself into trouble. And that's, some people time that out perfectly, and that's okay. What we're trying to do is just do what the market naturally and organically indicates is a good thing to do. If institutional providers are saying we want to be in this space and we want to have a hedged approach and we want to buy, private equity positions in operating licensed businesses, then we'll build it for them. But as of today, it's kind of been the opposite. You kind of have to build it and go out, and a whole bunch of people are trying to get some capital to go do something. And so I think it doesn't have to necessarily be legal, but descheduling and banking and a few more states doing some things. And those are things that can give you a lot of confidence to go ahead and move in the plant touching direction. That being said, a lot of amazing funds that we're close with do those deals today. We do them in SPVs. We definitely take shots on a few things, just not in the funds yet. So next year we will be, one way or another, I think we will be having a plant touching fund regardless of the environment, more so because we are anticipating certain things happening that will make that attractive.
I'm just going to ask you this question, and if it's not something that you have a take on, I can cut it out later. But we got the news that last week Vermont passed legislation that would allow the first recreational legal market to exist in the state, and it was essentially the Republican governor there, who has been standoffish against the legislature's push to pass it, allowed the bill to go into law without signing it, and basically wrote a letter kind of saying, I agree with the goal and intention, but it's not quite good enough. You guys have more work to do, but it's also good enough for it to go into law. When it comes to kind of like reading between the lines, I think it's interesting that you see politicians who have perhaps historically, their party has historically been against cannabis, perhaps finding ways to allow it to move forward. Do you have a read on that kind of thing? Like, do you think we'll see perhaps states out of an economic need become interested in cannabis in a way that they weren't before?
Well, we do. Go back and look at the alcohol prohibition ending. It's kind of an eerily similar situation. You had a pandemic 100 years ago, obviously. And then you moved into a war and depression and all kinds of stuff happening. And ultimately, alcohol prohibition ended. So basically, the similarities are kind of there, but we don't want to overgeneralize. It's a very specific movement, and I think what's happening in these environments is they may have had that feeling before, but they didn't know the difference. People are starting to understand what these products can do, and before they knew that information, it's hard to disagree with them. But the information is now there. It's changing people's lives. You see parents, mothers with sick kids that maybe have some type of brain issue. In particular, one case, cannabis can solve some epilepsy issues where the other option may be that the child has to remove a piece of their brain. Not kidding you. This happens. People have to go have their child a piece of their brain cut out. Can you imagine? And in some cases, cannabis makes it better. Can you imagine being a mother and saying something that God put on this earth from day one can help my child, and you're telling me no, and my other option is to cut a piece of my child's brain out? Wow. People are seeing that. Whether you're, a governor of Vermont or just a person sitting around reading the paper, those kinds of things are meaningful. And that didn't exist before. That information wasn't there. And so it does make sense. Again, it's the human-to-human connection. It's so strong. And this world is dying for it. I mean, look, this industry is so good for that. It really is. And so it doesn't surprise me. Those things are going to keep happening. 11 states, fantastic. We obviously have a lot more medical. And every little move forward or big move forward is good for the whole thing. If you look at Texas, when what you mentioned happens in Vermont, there are a lot of things that still exist in these environments. You might have had Texas have a potential to do something. It sounded like there were a lot of people in that state that may have voted in favor of cannabis, but you couldn't even get the bill to the floor. It didn't even make a vote. And so, what we believe in that environment is that there were people that just didn't want to have to vote no. They did everything they could to not give an answer because nobody wants to vote no. Even if you have to, you would do everything to just not have to actually say no because they know it's bad to do. And so I could see some of those things in Vermont too. I don't know the intricacies of it, but there are things that long tenured politicians have in terms of what they owe certain people that have supported them, is my guess. I'm not a politician. And he does have a duty to make sure that people are taken care of there. So in some ways, maybe he thinks it's not perfect and that's his job. But there could be something like Texas where you just have certain people that would rather publicly not have to make a determination, and that gives them a little more flexibility.
So I think I've got time for one more question for you here, and small change of subject. I know that you actually were a college football player, college quarterback, actually. And it is a weird year for football with COVID-19, obviously. Mm-hmm. But I guess I'm just curious on a personal level, with cannabis as an option medicinally becoming more and more accepted, and CBD and things like that. As a former athlete, do you hear people in that industry, being interested and curious about cannabis as a treatment option as opposed to opiates? And is that conversation perhaps something that could play into the cultural discussion about legalization in a big way?
Many athletes are already and have for many, many, many years utilized the plant for certain things, but in different professional leagues, that number is greater than others. I mean, people say in basketball, it's always been extremely high. Football, maybe a little bit lower, but my experience would say that athletes for decades and decades and decades have utilized these things, but they didn't have the products that knew to tell them exactly what it was, or the research, or the the different results from other folks using them that give them the confidence to, really replace some of those treatments with cannabinoid treatments. Now, I think when you look at the world that we're in, I think that it's beyond sports. It's just basic human rights. And the world we're in now, whether you're an athlete or you have a voice or not, people are wanting a higher quality life. They want to be healthier. They want to be more well. And this is a trend that was happening before COVID, but certainly more folks around the world are thinking about their health and wellness now more than maybe they ever have. And things like, Beyond Meats or, different types of gyms or home workout things, you have them on the wall now and you can just do your workout there, or the bike that you use in the house. I mean, people really, I think, are trending towards wanting to be healthier and have a more high quality life. And this is a way that people are understanding that they can do that. And, we're glad to be on here speaking with you. And I really do appreciate the time, because every moment that we have an opportunity to talk about how many good things this industry is doing for people in the world, we have to. We feel like it's our obligation. It's our right to talk about how good these things are. And we feel a responsibility to the industry as an investor to do this. And so thank you for asking that question about the athletes. I think that environment is going to continue to open up. Frankly, baseball and other ones never really tested for it anyways. I mean, they didn't have a problem. And so the NBA and the NFL will definitely follow, no doubt there in the next year or two. But more importantly, they have a voice, and what those athletes and people that have a voice are saying is, have a higher quality life, be healthy, be well, mentally, physically, spiritually, treat others right, treat yourself right. And our industry has a really good chance to do that for people.
Well, thank you, Matt. I really appreciate you taking the time to break all that down, and I know our listeners do too. Matt Nordgren is the founder and CEO of Arcadian Capital. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Oh, I appreciate you, and God bless.
You can find more cannabis industry reporting at trichomes.com, as well as more great shows like this one. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share with us, reach out. You can reach the show at highground@trichomes.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review. It really helps others find the show. You can also join the discussion with industry insiders and get your voice heard by joining the community at trichomes.com and following us on all social media. The show is produced by David Fortin. I'm Jesse Betend, and thank you for listening.